chopper flew overhead as red and blue lights flashed in the crisp night air. My boss's megaphone shrieked as he shouted into the streets surrounding the bank. Not a day from now, not a damn hour from now. We want an armored car parked out front in 10 minutes. Keys in the ignition, a straight path out of here. For every 3 minutes you keep us waiting, a hostage dies. Shoot me and you blow everyone straight to hell, you got that? His finger tightened on the dead man's trigger, and he gestured to the bomb strapped to him, one of the hostages, and his entire crew, including me. "The clock is ticking, officers," he screamed, firing several rounds from his automatic into the ceiling, provoking shrieks of terror from the hostages. With this, he raised the megaphone one last time, stepping into full, unobstructed view of the police force and declared coldly, "End of negotiations." Then he chucked the megaphone against one of the massive marble pillars in the bank, shattering it into a million pieces. He smiled as no officer took a shot, and after basking in the rays of floodlights and helicopter beams for a minute or two, he turned around and gestured to me and the hostages, saying, "Let's get these little shits locked up." "Yes, sir," I declared loudly, and then turning to the hostages bent over on the floor, some crying with fear, I shouted, "You heard him. Get the fuck up. I swear to God, if any one of you tries one goddamn thing, I'll blow all of your fucking brains out. Let's go." I wrestled some of them to their feet, waving my gun in their faces, screaming, "Move it! Move it!" Shrieking with fear and terror, they were all eventually herded to the back of the bank where the vault was and forcefully shoved inside, their bodies hitting the hard marbled floor and tumbling like rag dolls. "You better hope the people you're paying taxes for get their shit together, or I'll be seeing one of you again in 3 minutes, I sneered, closing the door. "And after that," I added, "it'll be just a little less crowded in there." The vault clicked shut. The boss nodded at me, signifying that I was to stay with the hostages, and then gestured to his 2 other men, both armed with automatic assault rifles, telling them to hold their positions. Radio chatter could be heard outside, and the whoop of sirens was only ever drowned out by passing helicopters as the high-tension stalemate continued, the seconds dragging on. No response had yet come from the police regarding our demands, and so after 3 minutes, he looked at me declaring, "They're not getting the message." It was clear what I was supposed to do. The clock struck 1:06 in the morning. The air suddenly chilled and a haunting, deep wind seemed to rush throughout the bank. I spun the heavy iron door handle, swinging the vault open and yanking a young man outside. I was careful not to grab the one with the bomb strapped to him, as we needed him inside with the others. The rest of the hostages screamed in protest, but none dared to interfere as my gun glinted in the dim light. The hostage I chose was sent tumbling across the shiny, reflective floor out into the open. I smiled at the other hostages and closed the door again as their faces drained of color. Scrambling to his feet in a panic, the chosen man instantly began a hopeless sprint for the door, screaming, "Help me! Jesus Christ, help!" The sound of machine gun fire ripped through the air, and after several sprays of blood, the man tumbled to the ground, a brutal snapping sound resounding throughout the vacant bank as his head hit the floor. His red ball cap slid across the floor, and his blue and green flannel shirt slowly became saturated with crimson as a pool of blood slowly spread across the once impeccably clean floor. I suddenly lost it, nearly falling to my knees as I tried to keep my stomach down. It was the strangest thing. I had watched many men die before my eyes and had even taken multiple lives myself, and yet something about this particular murder made my stomach suddenly churn violently as a horrible sickness gripped my heart. I looked over at our duffel bags stuffed with money, waiting to be loaded into the armored car and taken away from here. My stomach flipped as I saw some blood speckled on one of the bags. Surely what we were doing was unforgivable. Surely this money would be cursed. The panicked sound of radio chatter picked up, and although we couldn't hear what they were saying outside, it was clear that they were taking their options more seriously now. I slowly calmed myself down, closing my eyes and taking several deep breaths. Before long, I had regained my stone-cold composure and had convinced myself that this heist was of utmost importance. It was now 1:06 in the morning. Another 3 minutes had passed without so much as a response from the ever-mounting forces outside, and so, after receiving the order of, "Your 3 minutes are up," I swung the door open again, grabbing someone and throwing them outside as I kicked and screamed. I closed the vault on the remaining hostages and turned around. And then my blood froze. The hostage scrambled to his feet and began a hopeless dash for the door, his green and blue flannel flapping behind him as he screamed, "Help me! Jesus Christ, help!" Ear-piercing shots rang out and echoed throughout the bank. His run devolved into a tumble and his head hit the floor, making a brutal snapping sound. His red ball cap skidded across the mirrored floor. I stood paralyzed as I watched blood pump from his body as he lay there, having fallen just where the other hostage had just 3 minutes ago. Except, his was the only body there. The other body that had been there previously was gone, as if I just witnessed a tape rewind and play back what had just happened 3 minutes ago. I was in shock, my mouth dry as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. Surely it couldn't have been the same man. I watched him die just a few minutes ago. And yet there his body lay, as if he had just died for the first time. I looked at my boss, confusion and concern plastered across my face. But his face was cold and emotionless, as if he hadn't noticed anything strange at all. Neither had any of the other men. Believing I must have been going crazy from the stress, I took several deep breaths, tightening my hands on my gun and carefully adjusting the bomb vest strapped to me, its red light shimmering faintly, awaiting a signal, not at all hesitant to end my life. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly, taking in the sounds around me. The sounds of people scuffling around outside, surrounding the building, yet unwilling to enter. The sound of helicopters roaring overhead, helpless to do anything to help these people get home to their families. The sound of monetary value ever so slowly being weighed against human lives through distant radio talk. A light wind rustled outside, muffled by the massive glass panes making up the walls of the bank. Suddenly my boss shouted, "Your 3 minutes are up!" My eyes snapped open. It was 1:06 in the morning. I'd forgotten where I was for a minute, but I quickly realized and scrambled to open the vault door. The massive metal door swung open, and I reached forward, forcefully grabbing the same man. His red ball cap sat atop his head, and bunched in between my fists was his blue and green flannel shirt. I practically staggered backwards at his appearance. His skin was pale and colorless, dark splotches of dead skin on his face as his shirt had faint and spaced out traces of blood on it. He was alive, but just barely. Sensing my hesitation and taking advantage of my grip slackening, he wrenched himself free in terror and tried to run past me towards the door of the bank. A hopeless dash. "Help me, Jesus Christ, help!" he screamed. Before he even got halfway through the lobby, however, his insides were torn apart by molten metal, his legs ripped to shreds while a bullet or two exploded out the front of his head as he was gunned down. His body smashed against the marbled floor as the echoes of machine gun fire slowly faded away. I looked in panicked confusion as his body pumped out jets of blood, a small lake of blood expanding outwards from his downed corpse, lying some ways away from where it had been last time. And yet, once again, the other body had disappeared, leaving only this new corpse as proof that the man had been killed. The blood-soaked floor that once accompanied the other body was also completely dry and spotless, glimmering with polished, reflective beauty. As I whirled around in bewilderment, no one but me seemed to notice anything strange. "But, boss," I stammered slowly, my voice faint. "What the fuck do you want?" he screamed. "At a time like this?" I tried to quickly hide my confusion, masking it with a calm composure. "Sir," I shouted, "how many hostages is that now?" He looked at me, puzzled. "One, you idiot," he screamed. "What the hell do you mean by that?" Then, facing outside the bank, he added, "And in 3 more minutes, it'll be 2. My blood ran cold as I again looked at the ground in confusion, only to see a completely clean, mirror-like glossy marble floor staring back at me, not a body in sight. I thought I was the only one to notice these strange events, but that wasn't entirely true. Because as soon as I noticed that the body was missing, a horrible bout of shrieks came from inside the vault. I didn't even have time to react to this, however, because in the next second I heard my boss yell, "Your 3 minutes are up!" He waved his gun at me as I just stood there, trying to process what was happening. Did he even realize what he was saying? Didn't he know this was the third time he had said that exact same thing? Surely he didn't still think this was going to be the first time a hostage was killed. The clock read 1:06. Suddenly the boss snapped, screaming at me, yelling, "What the fuck are you doing, kid? We're not playing around, bring out the first hostage." I scrambled to open the door, only remembering the shrieks that had come from within once I got the door open, and understood why. It stood there, just behind the door, that man. Red ball cap, once green and blue flannel, now soaked with crimson blood, tattered and hole-punched. Its horrible, mutilated face stared at me, half its skin torn away, its scalp mangled with holes carving out its entirety. It was still alive, although I wasn't sure how. Its legs barely held it up, torn to shreds, mangled and spindly. The rest of the hostages stood, backed into a corner, cowering in terror, some shielding their eyes and others a bumbling mess, tears streaming down their faces. I reared backwards in horror as that thing stood there, breathing heavy, its dim, lifeless eyes looking straight ahead, or straight at me. Horrified and sickened, I pulled the trigger without thinking, firing several rounds into the ghastly creature's body, sending it reeling to the ground, convulsing and spitting up blood and guts, emptying its vile stomach onto the floor. Slowly it stopped twitching and its hollow eyes stared at the ground as it went limp, lying in a pool of its own chunky intestines and rancid vomit. "What the fuck?" my boss screamed. "I just wanted you to bring one outside. What the hell are you doing?" "Look at this," I screamed, dragging the thing out from the vault, slinging it across the room into plain view. As I did this, a few hostages suddenly decided to make a run for it, but I whirled around just in time to slam the door in front of them, locking them in. As my boss stared at the mangled thing lying before him, his face draining of color, I heard muffled shouts coming from inside the vault, screaming, begging to be shot. "Detonate the bomb," they shrieked. "Dear God, kill us, just get us out of this fucking thing." What? My boss stammered slowly. "You did all this with just a few bullets?" "No," I screamed. "That thing has been shot dead 4 times already. Surely you remember." He looked at me, his face suddenly hardening again. "Shot what?" he screamed. "What the hell are you talking about, boy? At a time like this?" "What do you mean? Wait. No, I cried, whirling back around to see blank, clean tiles, the body nowhere in sight. The clock read 1:06. "Oh, Jesus, no!" I screamed. My shrieks were quickly echoed by cries of terror from inside the vault. "What the hell is that?" A horrified, muffled cry rang out, and I heard fists begin pounding against the door, anguished screams erupting from inside. My boss suddenly shouted, "Your 3 minutes are up!" I didn't even wait for him to finish saying it. I had already begun wrenching open the door. I was going to save these people. Or that was the plan. When the moment came and the door swung open, however, I couldn't bring myself to do much of anything. I couldn't. I just stood there, my mouth agape, my legs growing weak. The vault was painted with blood, sticky globs of it slowly oozing down the walls and dripping in fleshy chunks from the ceiling. The few remaining hostages stood, huddled in a corner, utterly terrified of the thing standing before me. The rest of the hostages, not cowering in the corner, were everywhere. As for the man in the ball cap, it was a horrendous nightmare. Even more torn up than before, its body having sustained the damage taken by my careless shots before. Its shirt was more than torn away, its flesh in stringy webs, barely clinging on as its entrails spewed forth, rupturing from its torn open gut. It wasn't breathing. Not anymore. And yet it stood before me, coated in blood, only some of which was its own. Bodies adorned the vault, some almost in pieces, barely maintaining structure, discarded in heaps. From the thing's horrible, hyperextended jaw, a hand was reaching forth, a gray, lifeless, severed arm having been haphazardly swallowed by that thing. now caught in its throat. I scrambled backwards, and the remaining hostages darted past the thing, barely escaping its wild attempts to lunge at them. My boss and the rest of the men instantly gunned down the runaways, but some still made it as far as the door, one even getting her hand on the handle before her body was riddled with bullets, and she fell limp. Then my boss and the other men turned to me just in time to see the thing emerging from the vault, beginning a demented sprint towards me as I continued to scramble back, falling on my hands and knees. They immediately shouted in terror and opened fire on the creature, sending it reeling backwards as it was torn apart with molten lead. It finally hit the ground and stopped moving after thrashing around for a bit, its hollow eyes locked on me the whole time, using its last few moments of life to crawl slightly closer to me. I scrambled back up to my feet, weak and sickened, my heart pounding. "We have to get out of here," I screamed. "I don't care if we go to jail for life. I don't care if we get shot. We have to go now." "What do you mean?" the boss cried, his tone panicked. "What the hell was that thing?" "You've already seen it before," I yelled. "I don't have time to explain. Even I don't understand it, but time hasn't advanced at all, and certain aspects of this 3-minute loop seem to repeat while others carry over." "3-minute loop?" the boss screamed. "What the hell do you mean by that?" "No time," I cried. "Everyone resets after 3 minutes, losing your memories. We have to go now." The boss looked at me, and my blood thickened. His face was cold and emotionless again. The clock ticked. It was 1:06 in the morning. I whirled around in terror, spinning in rapid circles, clutching my head as I saw the bank lobby, completely empty. Not a body in sight, not the mutilated creature, nor the recently killed hostages who almost made it. There was nothing. I lost it. I began sprinting for the door. The boss shouted, "What the hell are you doing? Stop right now, or I swear to God I'll shoot you." I didn't care. I welcomed it, actually, because behind me, in the vault, I could suddenly hear the sound of several shuffling footsteps.